Today, we bring you one of the most impactful events recorded in Richmond, Virginia during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the grey light of dawn on April 3rd, 1865, Richmond burned. Not with the cleansing fire of rebirth, but with the desperate flames of destruction. Black smoke billowed over the Confederate capital as the last defenders set fire to tobacco warehouses, government buildings, and military stores before abandoning the city. The James River reflected the orange glow, carrying sparks downstream like dying fireflies. What had once been the impregnable heart of the Confederacy now lay exposed, vulnerable, waiting for the inevitable. Colonel Thomas Livermore of the 18th New Hampshire Volunteers would later write in his field journal, "The sound was unlike anything I had heard in 4 years of war. Not the thunder of artillery or the crack of rifles, but the low, continuous roar of a city consuming itself." 8 miles away, in the small crossroads village of Varina, Virginia, a weathered man in a grey uniform sat atop his horse, listening. According to accounts later collected by the Richmond Historical Society, Robert E. Lee had ridden to this vantage point in the early morning hours. From here, the sounds carried clearly across the open countryside. Explosions as ammunition depots were destroyed, the distant toll of church bells warning citizens, and occasionally, when the wind shifted just so, the faint shouts of thousands fleeing south across Mayo's Bridge. The official Confederate communique from that morning stated simply, "Richmond evacuated, stop, all government offices relocated, stop army in good order, moving west, stop." The document bore no signature, and the telegraph operator who transmitted it would later disappear from historical record entirely. For 4 long years, Lee had held the Army of Northern Virginia together through sheer force of will. 4 years of brilliant defensive maneuvers, of making the Union pay dearly for every inch of Virginia soil. But Petersburg had fallen the day before, and with it went any hope of saving the Confederate capital. Now, Richmond, the prize that had eluded Union Generals McDowell, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, and even Grant for so long, would fall without a fight. Captain William Gordon, a staff officer who claimed to have been present that morning, would tell a Richmond newspaper in 1869, "The general sat straight-backed in the saddle, as was his custom. Not a muscle moved in his face as the sounds of destruction reached us. It was only when he turned his mount to ride back to the column that I noticed his hands. They gripped the reins so tightly the knuckles had gone white." Whether Gordon was actually present remains disputed. Army records show a Captain William Gordon attached to the Provost Marshal's office, not to Lee's personal staff. The newspaper that published his account would close its doors in 1871, its archives largely lost in a basement flood. What is certain is that Lee had ordered the evacuation. The night before, President Jefferson Davis had received a telegram at his Franklin Street residence. "I advise that all preparation be made for leaving Richmond tonight." It was signed simply R. E. Lee. Within hours, the Confederate government was in chaos, loading documents and valuables onto trains bound for Danville. Davis himself departed on a special train at 11:27 in the evening, taking with him what remained of the Confederate treasury. The citizens who remained in Richmond awoke to a changed world. Elizabeth Van Loo, a Richmond resident whose Unionist sympathies had made her a valuable spy for the Federal forces, wrote in her coded diary, "From my window I saw them leaving. Soldiers throwing down their weapons, officials with boxes of papers, women carrying whatever valuables they could manage. Behind them, men with torches moving methodically from warehouse to warehouse. The fires soon grew beyond control. With no organized fire department remaining in the city, the flames spread rapidly through the commercial district. The ironworks that had produced the CSS Virginia, the artillery that had defended the city, and the Tredegar ironworks that had been the industrial heart of the Confederate war machine, all were engulfed. At approximately 7:15 in the morning, a small unit of Union cavalry from Major General Godfrey Weitzel's 25th Corps cautiously crossed the defensive lines and entered the burning city. They were not the conquering army that many had expected, but rather 100 or so scouts from the black regiments of the Union Army of the James. Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood, one of the first Union soldiers to enter Richmond, would note in his personal journal, "The streets were nearly deserted, though here and there faces, mostly colored, peered from windows and doorways. The only sounds were the crackling of flames and somewhere in the distance singing. The singing came from the city's enslaved population." As word spread that Union troops had entered Richmond, men and women who had lived their entire lives in bondage gathered on street corners, in churchyards, and along the routes the Union soldiers would take. According to accounts collected by the Freedmen's Bureau in June 1865, they sang hymns and spirituals, the songs that had sustained them through the darkest nights, as one report put it. The main body of Union troops would not arrive until later that morning, a delay that would later be questioned in congressional hearings. Brigadier General George F. Shepley, appointed as the military governor of Richmond, testified, "We had intelligence that retreating Confederate forces had mined bridges and key buildings. Caution was necessary to prevent further loss of life. Whether such mines existed has never been conclusively determined. No detonations were recorded as Union forces secured the city, and no plans for such defensive measures have ever been found in Confederate military archives. However, several pages appear to have been removed from the Engineering Corps logbooks for March 1865, a fact discovered during a 1892 inventory of captured Confederate documents. By 8:30 in the morning, the Stars and Stripes flew over the Confederate Capitol building for the first time since Virginia had seceded from the Union. Lieutenant Johnston de Peyster, a 20-year-old staff officer, and Captain Langdon Sheaves of the 4th Massachusetts Cavalry raised the flag together. De Peyster had carried that particular flag with him for weeks, hoping to be the one to replace the Stars and Bars over Richmond. A British observer, Colonel Arthur Fremantle, who had been in Richmond until 3 days prior, would later write in the London Times, "The Americans have a particular reverence for symbols that an Englishman might find excessive. To understand the war, one must understand what those bits of colored cloth meant to both sides." As Federal troops secured the city and began fighting the fires that threatened to consume it entirely, Robert E. Lee and the remnants of his once mighty Army of Northern Virginia continued their march westward. Their destination was Amelia Courthouse, where Lee expected to find supplies for his hungry troops. The railroad lines that had once efficiently moved men and material for the Confederacy were now cut, damaged, or under Union control. Major Walter Taylor of Lee's staff would later write, "I have never seen men so exhausted. They marched with eyes half closed, stumbling like sleepwalkers. Some fell and did not rise again. Yet when the general rode past, those who could still stand straightened their backs and raised their voices in greeting. Their devotion to him remained undiminished." What General Lee said to his men during that retreat has been recorded in various forms, each slightly different, each shaped by the memory and loyalty of the men who reported it. According to a letter written by Colonel Charles Marshall, Lee's military secretary, the general told a group of officers, "This is not the end. So long as there are men willing to stand together, there remains hope." Other accounts claim he said nothing at all during those long hours of marching, save for necessary orders. Lieutenant Colonel Armistead Long would write in his memoir, There was no need for speeches. Every man understood what was happening, and what might yet happen if we could reach Johnston's army in North Carolina. In Richmond, as the fires were gradually brought under control, President Abraham Lincoln arrived for a tour of the captured Confederate capital. It was April 4th, 1865, just one day after the city's fall. Lincoln, accompanied by his young son Tad and a small escort of sailors from the USS Malvern, walked through the still smoldering streets. Admiral David Porter, who was part of the president's entourage, would later recount, "I never witnessed such genuine enthusiasm as was shown by the colored people when they saw the president. They gathered around us, dancing, shouting, and praying. 'Glory to God,' they cried, 'the day of Jubilee has come.'" The presidential party made its way to the Confederate White House, where Jefferson Davis had lived and worked until just hours before. Lincoln sat briefly in Davis's chair, a moment captured not in photographs, but in the memories of those present. According to Porter's account, the president looked around the room and said simply, "This must be a difficult chair to sit in." The authenticity of this quote has been questioned. Admiral Porter's memoir was not published until 1885, 20 years after the events described. By then, Lincoln had been assassinated, martyred, and mythologized. Words that might reflect the great man's humility and wisdom were often attributed to him without verification. What can be verified through multiple sources is that Lincoln visited the Capitol building, Libby Prison, where Union officers had been held, and Castle Thunder, a Confederate prison for political detainees and Union spies. At each location, he asked questions about conditions and treatment of prisoners, making notes that would later be found among his papers. As Lincoln walked the streets of the defeated city, Lee's army continued its desperate march toward Amelia Courthouse. The roads were muddy from spring rains, slowing their progress and adding to the misery of men who had little food and less hope. According to quartermaster records discovered in 1895, many soldiers had been without rations for 2 days, and ammunition was critically low. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, commanding the 1st Corps, sent a dispatch to Lee that afternoon. "Men deserting in large numbers suggest immediate distribution of remaining food stores." The response, written in Lee's distinctive hand, was preserved in Longstreet's personal papers. "Divide what we have. We reach Amelia tomorrow, God willing." But when the Army of Northern Virginia reached Amelia Courthouse on April 4th, the expected supplies were not there. A communication error, never fully explained in surviving records, had resulted in the supply trains continuing past Amelia without unloading. Instead of the food and ammunition so desperately needed, Lee found only a small amount of ordnance and medical supplies. Captain Robert Stiles of the Richmond Howitzers wrote in his diary that night, "The men's faces when they heard the news, I shall see them in my dreams until I die. No outcry, no mutiny. Just the last light going out of their eyes." According to a report from Confederate Commissary General Isaac St. John, dated April 5th, a desperate search of the surrounding countryside yielded only enough food for 1 day's half rations. The delay at Amelia, as Lee's men foraged for whatever sustenance they could find, gave pursuing Union forces time to close the distance. In Richmond, federal authorities were establishing control and beginning the process of reconstruction. Major General Edward Ord, who had assumed command of the Department of Virginia, issued orders that all citizens were to remain in their homes between sunset and sunrise, that all weapons were to be surrendered, and that former Confederate soldiers were to register with Union Provost Marshals. A report from the Union Provost Marshal's office, dated April 5th, noted, "Several caches of arms discovered. Local citizens generally cooperative, though sullen. Former slaves continuing to arrive from surrounding counties, seeking protection and information about family members sold away." Elizabeth Van Loo, whose unionist activities were now known to her neighbors, found herself ostracized but protected by Union guards. She wrote in her diary, "The world has turned upside down in a day. Those who once held power walk with downcast eyes, while those who were property now walk the streets as citizens." It remains to be seen what will come of this revolution. On April 6th, at Sailors Creek, Virginia, nearly one-third of Lee's remaining army was cut off and captured by Union forces under Generals Sheridan, Custer, and Wright. Among the prisoners were 8 Confederate generals, including Lee's son, Major General W.H.F. Rooney Lee. The Confederate loss amounted to over 7,000 men who could not be replaced. When informed of the disaster, Lee reportedly exclaimed, "Half our army is destroyed." This quote appears in the memoirs of 3 different officers, though each places the statement at a different location and time, casting some doubt on its accuracy. What is certain is that by evening of April 6th, the once proud Army of Northern Virginia numbered fewer than 30,000 effectives, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted and hungry. Still, Lee pushed westward, hoping to reach the rail junction at Farmville, where supplies might be found, and then continue to Lynchburg. If he could reach the mountains of Western Virginia, Lee believed he might sustain a guerrilla campaign indefinitely. At least that is what Colonel Charles Marshall claimed in an 1877 interview with the Southern Historical Society. But other evidence suggests Lee had already recognized the inevitability of surrender. A coded message intercepted by Union signal officers on April 7th read, "Situation critical. Request terms." The message was signed with Lee's code name and addressed to the Confederate Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge. Whether the message was actually sent by Lee or was a Union forgery has never been conclusively determined. On April 7th, Grant sent his first letter to Lee, suggesting surrender. The letter, carried under a flag of truce by Colonel Orville Babcock of Grant's staff, was respectful, but direct. The result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. Lee's reply, preserved in the National Archives, neither accepted nor rejected Grant's overture. "I have received your note of this date. Though not entertaining the opinion you express of the hopelessness of further resistance, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer." The exchange of letters continued as the armies moved westward, with Union forces parallel to and south of Lee's line of march, effectively blocking the route to North Carolina and possible junction with General Joseph Johnston's army there. On April 9th, Lee made a final attempt to break through the Union lines at Appomattox Courthouse. When this failed, with his men surrounded and outnumbered, Lee agreed to meet Grant to discuss surrender terms. The meeting took place in the home of Wilmer McLean, a man who had moved to Appomattox to escape the war after the First Battle of Bull Run had been fought on his previous property. The surrender document was signed at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate officers and men would be paroled, officers could keep their sidearms, and all would be allowed to return to their homes. Most significantly, they would not be tried for treason, a point that had concerned Lee greatly, according to his staff officers. News of the surrender reached Richmond that evening by telegraph. The message was terse. "Lee surrendered today. Army of Northern Virginia disbanded. Grant's terms generous. The operator who received it, Thomas Ellsworth, kept the original tape as a souvenir. It was displayed in the Richmond Historical Museum until 1922, when it was destroyed in a fire. The city that had been the capital of the Confederacy for most of its existence was now firmly under Union control. Federal troops patrolled the streets. Former slaves began building new lives as freedmen, and white residents adjusted to defeat and occupation. On April 10th, news of Lee's surrender was officially announced to the citizens of Richmond. The Daily Whig, one of the few newspapers still publishing, printed an extra edition with the headline, "The War is Over." Below, in smaller type, it added, "Lee surrenders Army of Northern Virginia. Johnston expected to follow. Davis flees south." The next day, April 11th, in Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln delivered what would be his final speech, addressing the complex issues of Reconstruction. He spoke from a White House window to a crowd gathered on the lawn below, outlining a plan for reuniting the nation that emphasized reconciliation rather than retribution. 3 days later, Lincoln would be assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, the president who had presided over the nation's bloodiest conflict and who had lived to see its successful conclusion, would not live to guide the peace. In the decades that followed, the question of what General Robert E. Lee said when he saw the Union Army march into Richmond would become a matter of intense speculation and myth-making. Veterans organizations, historians, and ordinary citizens all claimed to know the truth, yet primary sources remained elusive. A letter purportedly written by Major Walter Taylor in 1872 claimed the general stood on the heights above the city and watched as the first Union flags appeared in the streets below. His only comment was, "This is a dark day for Virginia." I was at his side and heard these words myself, yet Taylor's published memoirs make no mention of this scene or quote. The letter, which surfaced in a private collection in 1921, has been the subject of authentication disputes ever since. Another account, from a Richmond citizen named Mary Fontaine, appeared in the Southern Illustrated News in 1867. "I saw General Lee myself that morning, riding slowly down the Osborne Turnpike. His face was like stone. When a young officer rode up and reported that Federal troops had entered the city, the general removed his hat briefly, as if in farewell, and said something too quiet for any but the officer to hear." The reliability of this account is questionable. The Osborne Turnpike was not on Lee's route of retreat, and Army records do not show his presence there on April 3rd. Furthermore, the Southern Illustrated News was known for publishing romanticized versions of events to boost Southern morale during the difficult Reconstruction period. Perhaps most intriguing is the account given by Reverend Jonathan Williams, a chaplain attached to the Stonewall Brigade, in a sermon delivered in 1875. When news came that Richmond had fallen and that Federal troops marched through streets where once Confederate Gray had proudly walked, I observed our beloved general closely. His lips moved in what I believe was prayer, though no sound escaped them. Later, as we rode, he said to those nearby, "We have only done what duty demanded. What comes now is in God's hands." Williams' reliability as a witness is complicated by the fact that the Stonewall Brigade was not with Lee during the retreat from Richmond, having been largely destroyed at the Battle of Cedar Creek 6 months earlier. The remnants of the brigade were serving under General John B. Gordon at the time Richmond fell. In 1893, the United Confederate Veterans Organization attempted to establish a definitive account of Lee's words and actions during the fall of Richmond and subsequent retreat. They interviewed dozens of surviving officers and men who had been present. The resulting report, published in the Confederate Veteran magazine, concluded, "No consensus can be reached as to the general's exact words upon learning of Richmond's occupation by Federal forces. What is consistent across all accounts is the dignity with which he received the news, his concern for the civilian population, and his determination to continue the struggle so long as any hope remained." This assessment aligns with what we know of Lee's character from more reliably documented incidents. The man who wrote to his wife in 1856, "Duty is the sublimest word in our language," was unlikely to have made dramatic pronouncements in the face of defeat. His personal stoicism and self-control were legendary among those who served with him. A diary entry from Colonel Charles Venable of Lee's staff, dated April 4th, 1865, perhaps comes closest to capturing the reality. The general received news of Richmond's fall with the same composure he has shown throughout this conflict. If he felt despair, he did not show it. If he felt anger, he did not express it. He simply asked for details of the evacuation and civilian casualties, then turned his attention to the movement of our reduced forces. As with many moments of historical significance, the truth of what General Lee said when he saw the Union Army march into Richmond may never be known with certainty. The chaos of war, the fallibility of human memory, and the powerful influence of lost cause mythology all obscure the historical record. What we do know is that Robert E. Lee, the man who had defended Richmond for 4 bloody years, was not present to witness its fall. He was already moving westward with the remnants of his army, fighting a rearguard action against overwhelming odds, searching for supplies that did not exist, and perhaps already knowing that surrender was inevitable. 6 days after Richmond's fall, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee would surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, effectively ending the American Civil War. In his final order to his troops, General Order No. 9, he wrote, "After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources." There was no mention of Richmond, the city he had defended for so long. Perhaps, in the end, that silence speaks more eloquently than any words attributed to him could. To this day, visitors to Richmond can walk the historic streets where Union troops marched in April 1865. They can stand on the heights above the James River, where Lee supposedly watched his life's work crumble. They can visit the White House of the Confederacy, where Lincoln sat in Davis's chair. But the words that passed between men in those fateful hours, the private thoughts of generals facing defeat, of soldiers facing an uncertain future, of slaves facing unexpected freedom, these remain largely in the realm of speculation and myth. As Lee himself wrote in a letter to former Virginia Governor John Letcher in August 1865, "The truth is this: what is past is beyond our control and should not too deeply engage our attention. Our chief duty is to think of the present and prepare for the future." It was advice that would guide Lee through the remaining 5 years of his life, as he worked to reconcile former enemies and rebuild a shattered nation. Perhaps that, more than any disputed quote about Richmond's fall, is his true legacy. In the spring of 1870, 5 years after Richmond's fall, a curious document surfaced in the possession of Colonel John S. Mosby, the famous Confederate partisan leader. It purported to be a personal journal kept by one of Lee's couriers, a Lieutenant James Weston of the 1st Virginia Cavalry. The journal contained an entry dated April 3rd, 1865, that read, "Accompanied the general to the overlook at dawn. The city burned below us, black smoke rising like a funeral pall. When word came that Federal troops had entered the eastern districts, the general removed his hat and said, 'And now the sword of the Lord and of Gideon.' I did not understand his meaning then, and do not now." The biblical reference to the Book of Judges, where Gideon defeats the Midianites against overwhelming odds, would have been characteristic of Lee's deep religious faith. However, authentication of the Western journal proved impossible. No Lieutenant James Weston appeared on the rolls of the 1st Virginia Cavalry, and the document itself disappeared after Mosby's death in 1916, leaving only transcriptions of dubious accuracy. Meanwhile, in the occupied Richmond of April 1865, a new order was taking shape. Major General Godfrey Weitzel established his headquarters in the former Confederate Executive Mansion, issuing a series of orders designed to restore order and basic services. City records indicate that by April 12th, most fires had been extinguished, though large sections of the business district remained in ruins. A report from the Union Quartermaster Department dated April 15th noted, issued 27,500 rations to citizens of Richmond, mostly women and children. Condition of many approaches, starvation. Recommend continued relief efforts. The city's black population, newly freed from bondage, faced both opportunity and danger in those chaotic days. Reverend Garland White, a former slave who had become a chaplain with the 28th United States Colored Troops, recorded his experiences entering Richmond with Union forces. The emotions that filled my heart when I marched into Richmond at the head of colored troops and close on the heels of the fleeing rebels, I cannot describe. I had escaped from this city as a slave and now returned as a freeman and a soldier to witness the downfall of the rebellion, the breaking up of the slave power, and liberation of my race. White's account, published in the Christian Recorder newspaper in May 1865, contrasts sharply with that of Mrs. Judith Maguire, a white Richmond resident who wrote in her diary, "The streets are filled with drunken Negroes, many in federal uniforms. They shout and sing the most obscene and insulting songs beneath our windows. We keep our curtains drawn and doors locked." Maguire's diary, published in 1867 as Diary of a Southern Refugee During the War, became one of the most widely read Confederate accounts of the war's final days. However, contemporary researchers have noted discrepancies between her published diary and the original manuscript, suggesting editorial changes were made to heighten the sense of threat from the freed slave population and occupying troops. What is clear from multiple sources is that the social order of Richmond was fundamentally transformed in those April days of 1865. A census taken by Union authorities in late April found that the city's population had decreased from approximately 38,000 to just over 21,000. Many white residents had fled south with the retreating Confederate government, while thousands of formerly enslaved people had entered the city seeking refuge and opportunity. The Richmond Examiner, which resumed publication under Union supervision on April 17th, reported, "Former slaves now walk freely on sidewalks, attend impromptu schools established in church basements, and hold public meetings to discuss their future. The world we knew is gone." As Richmond adjusted to occupation, Lee returned to the city on April 15th, one day after Lincoln's assassination. He arrived not as a conquering hero or defeated commander, but as a paroled prisoner of war, required to report to federal authorities. According to the Provost Marshal's log, Lee presented himself at headquarters at 10:30 in the morning, was interviewed for approximately 45 minutes, and then released to return to his home on East Franklin Street. Captain Robert E. Lee, Jr., the general's youngest son, wrote in his memoir, Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee, "Father returned from Appomattox with a heavy heart. I met him at the train station and scarcely recognized him, so grey and worn was his appearance. Yet there was in his bearing no hint of shame or defeat, only a profound weariness." The Lee family home had been confiscated by federal authorities during the war and converted into offices for the U.S. Sanitary Commission. The garden where Mary Custis Lee had once tended roses was now a cemetery for Union soldiers. The Southern Opinion newspaper, known for its unrepentant Confederate sympathies, published on June 3, 1865. "We have it on good authority that our beloved general, upon seeing the Yankee hordes enter our fair city, quoted from the Psalms, 'The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord.' No source was provided for this quote, and the Southern Opinion would be shut down by federal authorities 3 weeks later for publishing articles deemed seditious. The family moved into a rented house on Franklin Street, where they lived in relative poverty for the next several months. It was during this period that the first accounts of Lee's supposed words upon witnessing Richmond's fall began to circulate. Its editor, H. Rives Pollard, would be assassinated in 1868, allegedly due to a personal quarrel unrelated to his political activities. As federal control solidified and Richmond began the slow process of rebuilding, the mythology around Lee continued to grow. In a society devastated by defeat, Lee emerged as the embodiment of the lost cause, the idea that the Confederacy, though defeated, had fought nobly for constitutional principles rather than to preserve slavery. This view was codified in 1866 with the publication of Edward Pollard's influential book, The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederates. Pollard, who had been editor of the Richmond Examiner during the war, wrote, "If there is one man who in this war has won the admiration of the world and deserves to be ranked among the great captains of history, it is Robert E. Lee." The voluntary tribute of General Grant at Appomattox and the constant testimony of the enemy to his virtue and genius place him above the reach of calumny. Pollard's book made no specific mention of Lee's actions or words during Richmond's fall, but it established the framework through which many future accounts would be filtered. Lee as the perfect Christian knight, bearing defeat with the same dignity with which he had carried victory. In 1871, a new account emerged in the pages of the Southern Magazine. Colonel William Preston Johnston, son of Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston and former aide-de-camp to Jefferson Davis, claimed to have heard directly from Major Giles Cook of Lee's staff that the general had said, upon hearing of Richmond's occupation, "This is a sad business, gentlemen. But we have done our duty, and we must leave the result to God's wisdom." This quote, with its emphasis on duty and divine providence, aligned perfectly with the emerging lost cause narrative and was widely reproduced in subsequent histories. However, Major Cook's personal papers, examined after his death in 1937, contained no mention of this statement, despite extensive notes about his service with Lee during the war's final weeks. During the same period, a counter-narrative emerged from Union sources. Colonel Charles Francis Adams, Jr., grandson of President John Quincy Adams and an officer with the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, one of the first units to enter Richmond, wrote in the Atlantic Monthly in September 1872, "The rebels left their capital in a panic, setting fire to warehouses and bridges in their flight. Whatever calm dignity Lee may have displayed in the field, the evacuation of Richmond was marked by chaos and desperation." Adams made no claim to know Lee's words or thoughts, but his characterization of the evacuation contradicted the orderly retreat described in Confederate accounts. Military records tend to support Adams' version. The fires set by retreating Confederate forces spread beyond their intended targets, and the withdrawal of troops was hastened by the approach of Union forces, suggesting less organization than portrayed in Southern narratives. As the years passed and eyewitnesses began to die, the question of what Lee said became increasingly difficult to resolve. The general himself never wrote publicly about his feelings on Richmond's fall, though he did address the surrender at Appomattox in private correspondence. In a letter to former Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, dated February 1, 1868, Lee wrote, "I have thought for the good of the country and of the relations between the North and the South, the less that was said about the past, the better. The questions which existed between us were settled by the war." This reticence extended to his personal memoirs, which he began but never completed before his death in October 1870. The unfinished manuscript, which covered only his early life and Mexican War service, was never published and was eventually lost, with only fragments surviving among family papers. John Easton Cook's popular 1871 novel, Wearing of the Grey, included a scene in which Lee, like a Roman of old, watched from afar as his beloved city burned, shedding no tear, but inwardly bleeding for every flame that rose to heaven. This romanticized image, Lee as stoic observer of tragedy, was reinforced by Edward Valentine's 1875 marble statue, Lee in Defeat, which depicted the general with head bowed but shoulders unbowed, the personification of dignity in adversity. In the absence of definitive evidence, the public's understanding of Lee's reaction to Richmond's fall became increasingly shaped by artistic representations rather than historical documentation. The statue was displayed in the newly established Confederate Museum in Richmond, housed in the former Confederate Executive Mansion, where it remains to this day. By the late 19th century, the Lee mythology had become so entrenched that questioning any aspect of it was seen as an attack on Southern identity itself. When William Garrett Brown, a Harvard-trained historian from Alabama, suggested in an 1898 lecture that Lee had lost his tactical genius in the war's final months, he received death threats and was denounced in Southern newspapers as a traitor to his heritage. The turn of the century brought a wave of Confederate monument building across the South, with Lee as the central figure in this bronze and marble pantheon. In 1907, the equestrian statue of Lee on Monument Avenue in Richmond was unveiled before a crowd estimated at 100,000 people. The dedication speech by former Confederate General Stephen D. Lee, no relation, made no specific reference to the fall of Richmond, focusing instead on Lee's character. He was a foe without hate, a friend without treachery, a victor without oppression, and a victim without murmuring. This sanitized version of Lee, almost divine in his perfection, became the standard representation in Southern textbooks, memorials, and popular culture. Any evidence that might complicate this image, including conflicting accounts of his words and actions during Richmond's fall, was either ignored or actively suppressed. It was not until the civil rights era of the 1960s that this monolithic interpretation began to be seriously challenged. In 1961, Robert Franklin Durden of Duke University published The Gray and the Black, a collection of Confederate writings on the question of arming slaves for military service, a desperate measure considered in the war's final months. The documents revealed that Lee, contrary to popular belief, had supported the idea, acknowledging that such a step would necessarily lead to emancipation. Durden's work opened the door to a more complex understanding of Lee and the Confederate leadership. In 1975, Thomas Connolly's The Marble Man, Robert E. Lee, and His Image in American Society directly challenged the Lee mythology, arguing that much of what Americans knew about Lee was the product of post-war myth-making rather than historical fact. Connolly specifically addressed the question of Lee's reaction to Richmond's fall, writing, "There exists no reliable contemporary account of Lee's words or thoughts as Richmond fell to Union forces. The various quotes attributed to him in later years reflect the needs and beliefs of those doing the attributing more than any historical reality." This revisionist view gained further support in 1981 with the publication of Alan Nolan's Lee Considered, General Robert E. Lee and Civil War History, which argued that Lee's aggressive tactics had hastened Confederate defeat and that his post-war image had been carefully constructed to serve political ends. The debate intensified in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as historians increasingly examined the Civil War through the lens of race and slavery rather than military tactics alone. In 2000, historian Brooks Simpson noted in The Civil War in the East, Struggle, Stalemate and Victory that Lee's decision to abandon Richmond, necessary as it may have been militarily, doomed thousands of enslaved people to continued bondage as they were forced to accompany the retreating Confederate forces. This perspective, considering the human cost of military decisions, represents a significant departure from earlier histories that focused almost exclusively on strategy, leadership, and the experiences of white combatants. In 2007, Elizabeth Brown Pryor's Reading the Man, a Portrait of Robert E. Lee through his private letters, offered perhaps the most nuanced view to date, drawing on previously unpublished correspondence to reveal Lee as neither saint nor sinner, but a complex human being shaped by his time and circumstances. Regarding Richmond's fall, Pryor concluded, "If Lee left any record of his feelings as he received news that Richmond had been occupied, it has not survived. What we do know is that he continued to focus on his military responsibilities, attempting to extract his army from an increasingly hopeless position and minimize further bloodshed." This assessment, based on documentary evidence rather than legend, may be as close as we can come to understanding Lee's true reaction to the fall of the city he had defended for so long. Today, visitors to Richmond can walk the historic streets of the former Confederate capital, now a vibrant mid-sized city that has struggled to reconcile its Confederate past with its diverse present. The American Civil War Center at historic Tredegar, located on the site of the Confederacy's primary ironworks, presents the war from Union, Confederate, and African-American perspectives, acknowledging the complexity that earlier generations often denied. Monument Avenue, once lined with statues of Confederate leaders, has been transformed following the racial justice protests of 2020. The Lee statue, which stood for 113 years, was removed by city authorities in September 2021, leaving only its empty pedestal as a reminder of changing historical interpretations. What General Robert E. Lee actually said when he saw or heard that Union troops had entered Richmond remains unknown and perhaps unknowable. The historical record offers contradictory accounts, none with unimpeachable provenance. Yet the question itself reveals much about how Americans have understood and misunderstood their most divisive conflict. In the absence of definitive evidence, perhaps the most honest approach is to acknowledge that Lee, like all historical figures, was neither the marble man of lost cause mythology nor the simplistic villain of some modern interpretations. He was a human being facing the collapse of the cause to which he had dedicated 4 years of his life, a cause inextricably bound up with the defense of slavery, whatever his personal views on that institution might have been. If we cannot know his exact words as Richmond fell, we can at least approach the question with the humility that comes from recognizing the limits of historical knowledge and the complexity of the human experience, even, or perhaps especially, in times of war. The mystery of what General Lee said when the Union Army marched into Richmond may never be solved with certainty. But in that uncertainty lies an important historical lesson, that even our most cherished narratives about the past require constant re-examination, and that history itself is not a fixed story, but an ongoing conversation between the present and the past.